I know that at first glance this might seem like a Disney bad, Dreamworks good video, but I can assure you that is not what this video will be at all. This is an opinion that I have held since childhood, and it has seemingly never changed all these years later. My preference of Dreamworks over Disney has nothing to do with the current state of Disney nowadays. This has nothing to do with Wish or the live-action remakes or anything like that. This is an opinion that I have held since childhood, and it has never changed ever since. I guess, in a way, technically, how Disney is nowadays strengthens my preference of Dreamworks, but I don't know. For the most part, I'd say the way that Disney is nowadays is unrelated to my preference of Dreamworks. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about why I prefer Dreamworks over Disney, and I'm also going to be talking about a couple other Dreamworks related topics, such as the controversial Megamind sequel, the upcoming How to Train Your Dragon live action remake, and the recent layoffs at Dreamworks. Just basically go through all of these topics within this same video. Why not? If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. With that said, let us dive in. I'm going to say something that might baffle some of you. Something that you will never see any other cartoon YouTubers say. I never really grew up with Disney all that much. Like, when it comes to Disney movies themselves, only like a couple of them I grew up with. Obviously, I grew up with Disney. It's pretty fucking hard to grow up without Disney. In some way, shape, or form, you will grow up with something Disney related. Whether it be like the Disney canon movies, Pixar, any of the cartoons, Phineas and Ferb and whatever, in some way, shape, or form, you will grow up with something relating to Disney. Now, speaking of Pixar, I'd like to say that most of the stuff I'm going to talk about in this video only applies to Disney themselves, and Pixar is exempt from this. It is near damn impossible for me to determine, do I like Dreamworks more or do I like Pixar more? That is a much harder question for me to answer. Disney versus Dreamworks, that's easy. I prefer Dreamworks. Pixar versus Dreamworks, that's a little bit harder. I'll have to take more time to think about that. Because even though the quality of most modern Pixar movies aren't that great, their golden age material, that's like undeniable right there. Stuff like The Incredibles and Up, they're like, you cannot f***ing deny them at all. So it is much harder for me to determine if I like Pixar more or if I like Dreamworks more. This video is mainly just Disney only. But yeah, with a few exceptions, I never really grew up with that many movies from Disney. There are over 60 movies in the Disney canon, and I don't even know if I've seen like 25 of them, 30 of them, anything like that. When it comes to the Disney Renaissance, I think the only movie in it that I have any like real nostalgia for would be The Lion King. I remember I used to watch The Lion King all the time. I know it's considered the best movie in the Disney Renaissance and arguably the Disney canon as a whole, so that might be a cliche pick, but that's just how I was. I did watch Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and Mulan from time to time as a kid, yet I don't really have many memories of them. I didn't really watch them that much. I did watch them from time to time, but I don't want to say I watched them enough to have like fond childhood memories for them or anything like that. The Little Mermaid is a bit of a weird movie because like I watched it when I was extremely young and I have like zero memories of it. It would be much easier for me to say that I've never seen it at all, really. Hercules and Tarzan I would not watch for the first time until much later, years later, when I became much older. And then the remaining 3 movies in the Disney Renaissance I've straight up never seen as of making this video. And dude, don't even get me started on like the pre-Renaissance movies. I've seen even less of those movies. I've only seen 3 of the pre-Renaissance movies. Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, and 101 Dalmatians, and the only one that I watched as a kid was Alice in Wonderland. Peter Pan and 101 Dalmatians I wouldn't watch until I was much older, and I don't even know if I want to count Alice in Wonderland 100% because I didn't watch it a lot when I was a kid. I remember back around 2015, we had to do like a school play for Alice in Wonderland, and then on some days, instead of rehearsing for the play, I played an extremely minor role in it, thank God. But on some days, instead of rehearsing for the play, we would just sit down and watch the movie, I guess to like do research on what we should do. And I don't remember how long the rehearsals lasted. It was like either 30 minutes or an hour, I'm not sure. It was always like the last part of the school day before we all went home, and I think it was only on like certain days, like every Tuesday and Thursday. I don't think it was like every single day we did it, I don't remember. And we never finished the whole movie either. I never finished it at all. On some days we would come in and they would just play the movie from the very beginning, or they would like start up at like a specific scene and we would just watch it even if we've already seen that scene before. Which, I mean, yeah, I get that, why we would have to do that, it to help us memorize what to do, but like still, it just kind of annoyed me. Dude, I swear, it's like, we go into the classroom, they put on the Walrus and the Carpenter scene, and in my head I'm just thinking, oh, for f***'s sake, this is the 20th time we've seen this damn scene. I want to finish the movie, please. I wouldn't watch Alice in Wonderland in its entirety until, surprise, surprise, I became much older. So if you want to count this whole thing as me having nostalgia for Alice in Wonderland, then go for it, I guess. I don't know. But that's about it, really. I think like the only Disney movie that I really loved as a kid, like I had immense nostalgia for it, would be like a Goofy movie. And that's not even considered part of the Disney canon, so, you know, there's that. Doesn't change the fact that it's the best Disney movie, but still. Again, it is important for me to note that Pixar is completely exempt from this. Of course I grew up with Pixar. How could I not grow up with Pixar? Of course I grew up with like Toy Story and The Incredibles and Finding Nemo. I grew up with all those films. I understand that like they're technically not the same thing as Disney, but like if you want to count it, I guess sure. I guess I was comparatively more of a Pixar kid than a Disney kid. I don't know. And then in addition to that, I watched Dreamworks a lot more. I don't know why, I just kind of did. Maybe it's just nostalgia bias, really. Like, of course I wouldn't watch a bunch of these, like, really old movies from the 50s and 60s and whatever. But then, like, stuff that was more recent at the time, like Madagascar and Over the Hedge, of course I would be into that more. I'm not sure what it is, but I just get this, like, weirdly comforting feeling watching a lot of older Dreamworks movies from the 2000s and early 2010s. Again, maybe it's just nostalgia, but like, I just feel safe watching most of these movies. I don't know why. There's just something about DreamWorks movies that connect to me in a way that like movies from other animation studios don't. I understand that the following opinion might be just a wee bit controversial, but this is just kind of how I feel. Is it bad that I think the best DreamWorks movies are better than the best Disney movies? Like a few years ago, I watched Peter Pan for the first time, and it's like, yeah, I get it. Peter Pan is meant to be a classic. It's meant to be this, like, historical movie and whatever. I just thought it was fine. Like, I didn't think it was a bad movie at all, but, like, it was just fine to me. I didn't really see what was so special about it. It's not really, like, a movie that I would sit down and watch a second time. That's, like, the main thing. It doesn't have any sort of rewatch value to me. Is it bad that I unironically think stuff like Kung Fu Panda and Megamind and whatever, I think, like, those are much stronger movies than Peter Pan? Because that's just kind of how I feel, really. And then a few days after that, I would go and watch 101 Dalmatians for the very first time, and it's like, I thought that was a much stronger movie than Peter Pan, but at the same time, like, it doesn't really click with me, like, it doesn't resonate with me. Maybe it's just because it's like a really old movie or something, I have no idea. I didn't grow up with it, I'm not sure, but it's just like, I have no incentive to ever like sit down and watch 101 Dalmatians again a second time. In general though, I feel like this could easily apply to a lot of the movies in the Disney canon whenever I do watch them. I sit down, I watch these movies, and I think, yeah, that was pretty good, but I'm not going to like really care about it all that much. It's not going to have any sort of lasting impact on me. I sit down, I rewatch The Little Mermaid after all these years, and it's like, I think it's a good movie, but like that's kind of it really. I don't think much of it. It's not going to become like a beloved favorite of mine or anything like that, something that I'll be thinking about non-stop. It's just going to be a solid animated movie, and that's it. Obviously, there are exceptions to this. There are Disney movies out there that can hit you emotionally in some way, but unfortunately, they are few and far between. And so like stuff like Alice in Wonderland is a good movie, don't get me wrong, but like I don't really think much of it. It's just a movie that exists. It's just there and that's it. Not a bad movie at all, but just I don't see any reason to ever sit down and watch it again a second time. Now obviously it's pretentious for me to assume that every animated movie should have some deep thought-provoking message or theme or whatever in it. And obviously not every Dreamworks movie is like this. Nobody goes into Madagascar expecting, you know, deep metaphorical themes or anything like that. But the thing is, even though there are far more Disney movies than Dreamworks movies, I feel like there are more Dreamworks movies that just, you know, cover darker, more, like, they just have themes in them when compared to Disney. Disney could never make Kung Fu Panda or How to Train Your Dragon or anything like that. Like, they just could never. Regardless of which era, you know, back when Walt Disney was alive, the 70s and 80s when they were struggling, the Disney Renaissance, the post-Renaissance, the early 2010s, you know, regardless of which time period, even if you look past how they are nowadays and you decide like, oh, back during the 90s when they were good, during the Renaissance era, it's like, no, they could never make these sort of movies. If Disney made Megamind, it would probably just be a generic good guy versus bad guy movie. None of the clever subversions of the superhero genre that the film has would be there. And as much as I hate to say it, this is kind of the same thing for Pixar nowadays. I mean, obviously Pixar's older movies, they're nothing like this at all, but when it comes to their new stuff, for sure, they're suffering from the same problem. I realize now while making this video, the main problem with like modern Pixar when compared to old Pixar. Old Pixar was not afraid to take risks. Old Pixar was not afraid to showcase themes in their movies that you would never see in any other animated movie, including those from Disney themselves. Modern Pixar plays it a lot more safe in comparison. Most of their modern movies just don't take the same risks that their older films did. And as a result of that, a lot of their modern movies, they just don't feel as memorable as their classic movies. They don't have the same legacy or lasting impact that their older films had. Something like Luca, for example. Like, you know, these movies, they're still good. They're not terrible or anything like that. You know, Luca is still a perfectly fine movie. There is nothing wrong with it at all, but like, be honest with me, you forgot about this movie's existence until I brought it up just now. Because even though this is not a bad movie, it's not a very memorable movie either. I remember reading something that was like, they had to cut out 2 emotions out of Inside Out 2 because they made the film too depressing and not fun to watch, and it's like, what's wrong with that necessarily? What's wrong with taking that risk and showing more serious themes into your movies? Kids eventually are going to learn about like serious things in the world. It's okay to teach these kids about how life is and how it's not perfect or great or anything like that. That there is a bad side to life. I already didn't really have much interest in Inside Out 2, and this just kind of further pushed me away from it, especially considering how great the first film was. And that feels like the perfect, you know, movie to implement like more serious themes in them, to take more risks and do something different. It just bothers me knowing that like we are never going to get another Pixar movie like The Incredibles ever again. We're never gonna see something like the opening scene from Up ever again. Like, those are just never going to happen. You are never going to see this in a modern Pixar movie, and that saddens me very much. As I said before though, this is an issue that's more affected by Disney when compared to Pixar. Again, there are a lot of great Disney movies out there, don't get me wrong, but it's just like, I feel like the best Dreamworks movies are better than a lot of the best Disney movies. Like, The Little Mermaid is an undeniable classic. You know, I'm not saying it's bad or anything like that. I'm sure it's a great movie, but like, is it really better than How to Train Your Dragon? Like, honestly. Now, even though I generally prefer DreamWorks movies over Disney movies, I will acknowledge one thing. DreamWorks is not perfect. Not all of their movies are great. Sometimes, here and there, they will put out a dud, and that's normal. DreamWorks is notoriously inconsistent when it comes to the quality of their films, and I feel like that's something that most people completely forget about nowadays whenever they talk about them. It all started a few years ago in 2022 when they released both The Bad Guys and Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, both of which are considered some of their strongest movies, with Puss in Boots in particular becoming the most acclaimed DreamWorks movie in a long time. Many people pointed to this film thinking, oh, this was gonna start like a new golden age for DreamWorks or something like that. They're gonna start putting out perfect movies from now on. And then you cut to the following year in 2023, where they would put out Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken, and Trolls Band Together. Neither one of these movies were particularly very good. Ruby Gillman in particular was a massive flop at the box office, which, I mean, I thought it was a not very good film, so that's not surprising to me at all, but still. And then so far in 2024, they have put out Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate, the long-awaited sequel to the 2010 cult classic, which ended up being a very bad movie, as well as Kung Fu Panda 4, which I haven't seen yet, but I've heard very mixed things about it. The general consensus of the film, though, from what I've heard, is it is nowhere near as good as the first three movies. It is a massive step down, so that's unfortunate. And so it seems that a lot of people are now starting to make these what happened to DreamWorks videos, downfall of DreamWorks, stuff like that, questioning how they went from Puss in Boots: The Last Wish to Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate. Well, the answer is simple. DreamWorks has always been inconsistent. In fact, I kind of like that about them, in a way that just kind of adds something to them. I'm not sure what. The quality of their movies are inconsistent in a way that like no other animation studio's quality is. In 2004, they released Shrek 2, which is widely considered one of their best movies, and then they follow that up with Shark Tale, which is widely considered one of their weakest movies. In 2017, they released The Boss Baby, which, although that made a lot of money for DreamWorks at the box office, I don't think there's anyone that would consider it one of the best DreamWorks movies. And then they released that alongside Captain Underpants, which a lot of people, in contrast, would consider one of the best DreamWorks movies. It will never not be funny to me the fact that like B-Movie was followed up with Kung Fu Panda. Now this is a bit of a different example because I'm one of those weird people that unironically likes B-Movie for some reason, but I cannot ignore just how funny it is just going from B-Movie to Kung Fu Panda. Kung Fu Panda is, again, one of the more serious DreamWorks movies in a way. There are a lot of jokes in it. It is a mostly lighthearted movie, but there are serious themes here and there in it. The film comes out, it ends up being a massive critical and commercial success, and it starts a huge franchise for DreamWorks. It becomes one of their biggest franchises. And you want to know what came before it? A movie where Jerry Seinfeld voices a bee that falls in love with a human and tries to soothe the entire human race. This is why I love DreamWorks, man. Disney could never, seriously. DreamWorks has always been inconsistent with the quality of their movies. That's normal. I frequently joke about the downgrade going from Puss in Boots: The Last Wish to Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken, but like, that's just DreamWorks being DreamWorks. They've always been like that. DreamWorks could make the most amazing, life-changing animated movie you've ever seen in your life, and then they'll immediately follow it up with f***ing Trolls 7 or whatever, Boss Baby 4. It's happened before, and it will continue to happen. Now, DreamWorks is often hit or miss when it comes to their movies. They're very inconsistent. However, there is one thing that they are consistently good at doing, doing. And I know that this video is meant to be for like why I personally prefer DreamWorks over Disney. However, I figured just because I might as well bring up something that I think DreamWorks is objectively better at than Disney. Even if you prefer Disney, you cannot deny this is something that DreamWorks is better at doing. Sequels. When it comes to Disney and Pixar sequels versus DreamWorks sequels, it's no competition. DreamWorks is far better at making sequels than Disney and Pixar are. Listen, I think that Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate is a crappy movie, don't get me wrong, and I'm sure Kung Fu Panda 4 is just this mediocre, disappointing film, but don't let these two movies change your mind on how DreamWorks makes their sequels, because more often than not, DreamWorks knocks it out of the park when it comes to the quality of their sequels, especially when compared to Disney and Pixar. When it comes to Pixar, the only great sequels they've put out are Toy Story 2 and Toy Story 3, and that's it. Most of their other sequels, it's like, they're not bad, but they're not like amazing either. You know, Finding Dory is a good movie, but like, it's nothing really special. It's nowhere near as good as the first Finding Nemo. Sometimes though, Pixar sequels can be quite a bit disappointing in a lot of ways. You have Cars 2, aka the movie that started Pixar's mediocre age, I guess. It was the film that ended Pixar's streak of perfect movies, and it ended their golden age. Pixar would never be the same after Cars 2. Thankfully though, the Cars franchise did manage to make a bit of a comeback with Cars 3 in 2017, which was a massive improvement. In fact, I would actually go as far as to say that Cars 3 is the strongest Pixar sequel that isn't Toy Story 2 or Toy Story 3. If I were to do a ranking of all the Pixar sequels from best to worst, I would say Cars 3 is the third best one, behind Toy Story 2 and 3. I don't know if I think Toy Story 2 is the better movie or if Toy Story 3 is the better movie, I'm not sure, but regardless though, these two movies definitely take up the top two spots of the Pixar sequel ranking, with third place going over to Cars 3. And even if Cars 3 is the third best Pixar sequel, it's still not an amazing movie or anything like that. And then you have The Incredibles 2, which the more that I think about it, the more disappointing it becomes. In fact, I think I might have underestimated just how disappointing this movie is when I made a video on it a few months ago. I don't think it's a terrible movie necessarily, but like, it is so inferior to the first film. There's nothing about Incredibles 2 that's like inherently awful, but it feels like it's just the bare minimum. The bare minimum for a good sequel to The Incredibles. None of the themes or anything like that that made the first film so amazing are present in Incredibles 2, and that just makes the film feel kind of uninteresting in comparison. I haven't watched the first Incredibles in a while. I need to rewatch it at some point. I think I am long overdue for a rewatching of the first Incredibles. However, even though I haven't seen The Incredibles in a while, I still remember a lot of what happens in it. I rewatched Incredibles 2 fairly recently, around November to December of 2023, for a video that I would make on it, and already I've forgotten most of what happens in it. It's just nowhere near as interesting, nowhere near as memorable as the first Incredibles. And then you have Toy Story 4. Which is, well, Toy Story 4. It needs no further explanation. And then don't even get me started on Disney. If you want to get technical, there are only 4 proper sequels that Disney have ever put out, and none of them are particularly great movies. The Rescuers Down Under, Fantasia 2000, Ralph Breaks the Internet, and Frozen 2. That's it. Those are the only proper sequels that Disney has made so far. Ralph Breaks the Internet is complete garbage, and I see almost nobody acknowledge the existence of the other 3 movies, which I think is indicative of their quality. The fact that The Rescuers Down Under is the only film in the Disney Renaissance that isn't a beloved, cherished classic that everyone knows and loves, I feel like that says a lot to me. It's just like the forgotten black sheep of the Disney Renaissance. That film that came between The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and was intended to be a sequel to a movie that nobody remembers either. And then you have all of those infamous direct-to-video Disney sequels from the 90s and 2000s, most of which are not very good. I mean, to be fair, not all of these movies are bad. There are a couple gems here and there. I remember when I was a kid, I thought an extremely goofy movie, The Lion King 1.5 and Kronk's New Groove were all pretty good movies, so, you know, there are gems. I haven't seen it, but I've heard that Cinderella 3 is actually an unexpectedly good movie for direct-to-video Disney sequel standards, so shout out to Cinderella 3 for that. There are gems here and there, but for the most part, these movies range from being mediocre to being really bad. And the funny thing is, a lot of these are sequels to beloved Disney classics. Stuff like The Little Mermaid and The Lion King and whatever, they never got proper sequels. They just got these cheap direct-to-video movies, and that's it. It's so funny to me how, like, The Rescuers, a movie that nobody cares about, that's one of the only Disney movies to get a proper theatrical sequel. But then, like, the really big, famous stuff, like The Lion King and whatever, just cheap, low-budget direct-to-video stuff, and that's it. I know that The Rescuers Down Under came out before they started making direct-to-video Disney sequels, but it's just really funny to me, the fact that, like, this is one of the only proper sequels that Disney's ever put out. Oh, and then you also have Peter Pan 2 and The Jungle Book 2, which are in this, like, weird gray area. They weren't direct-to-video movies, they were theatrically released, however, they're not considered part of the Disney canon. As a matter of fact, I believe that these 2 movies were originally intended to be direct-to-video movies, but then for some reason they got a theatrical release, I don't know. But again, I barely see anyone talk about either of these movies when compared to the first Peter Pan and the first Jungle Book, so you know what, I think they still perfectly prove my point. In contrast, Dreamworks often succeeds with their sequels. You know, Shrek 2 is a banger, Madagascar 2 and 3 are bangers, Kung Fu Panda 2 is a banger, you know, it's stuff like that. Yeah, okay, Megamind 2 sucks, but like, that doesn't mean that Dreamworks sequels are bad. You know, I'm going to get backlash for saying this, but like, thinking about it more, in a way, I kinda understand why the Megamind sequel turned out the way that it did. I don't like how the movie turned out at all. I don't like the fact that, like, Will Ferrell isn't back to voice Megamind. I don't like the cheaper looking animation. I don't like that stuff, but like, I kinda understand why it turned out like this. Like, when you really think about it, why on earth would DreamWorks go out of their way to make a proper theatrical sequel to a niche movie that they put out in 2010, almost 14 years ago? Even with the cult following and critical re-evaluation that the first Megamind has gotten in recent times, even with all the people that are now calling it one of the best DreamWorks movies, it's still a very underground niche movie. Most people aren't going to recognize Megamind in the same way they recognize Shrek or Kung Fu Panda. Megamind versus the Doom Syndicate shouldn't even be talked about when discussing DreamWorks sequels, because DreamWorks themselves didn't make it. It was their television subsidiary that made it instead. And once you remember that, all of a sudden, the cheaper quality of the movie makes a hell of a lot more sense. It doesn't make it good, but it makes a lot more sense now. The way I see it, DreamWorks, the main animation studio, is busy cooking up all these other animated movies, and so like, they're aware that this old movie they put out has been getting a lot more attention, and because of that, they basically get their television subsidiary to bring this old DreamWorks movie that's gotten more attention back. This movie was basically just a side project for DreamWorks. It's not like a main film or anything like that. And more likely than not, this will just be a one-time thing. DreamWorks won't start making cheap, low-budget, straight-to-streaming sequels to their movies. Whenever we get Shrek 5 or Madagascar 4 or whatever, they're going to be proper theatrical sequels. And that's another thing as well, again, going back to what I was saying, it wouldn't make sense for this niche Dreamworks movie from 2010 to get a proper theatrical sequel all these years later. If the first film was a bigger success at the box office, then for sure it would have gotten a proper sequel, but it wasn't that much of a success at the box office. And the general consensus of the movie at the time was it was good, but it wasn't like amazing or anything like that. The masterpiece reputation that the movie has now, it wouldn't get it until much later on. I know that people could bring up something like Puss in Boots, for example. The first Puss in Boots came out in 2011, and it's a good movie, don't get me wrong. It's considered a good movie, but it's often considered nothing special. It's not a very remarkable film or anything like that. And then out of nowhere, 11 years later in 2022, it gets a sequel, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, and just out of nowhere it ends up being one of the best Dreamworks movies. It ends up being significantly better than the first Puss in Boots, and it becomes one of the best movies that Dreamworks has ever put out. So you might be thinking, why would Dreamworks make a proper sequel to Puss in Boots, but not a proper sequel to Megamind? Well, you see, here's the difference. Number one, the Puss in Boots sequel had been in development for a very long time, since at least 2012. The first movie came out in 2011. I remember seeing an old article from the early 2010s, from like shortly after Megamind came out, stating that like the studio had no intentions to ever make sequels to some of their movies, including Megamind. This movie literally only exists because of the cult following that the first movie has received, and that's it. Number two, the first Puss in Boots was a massively successful film at the box office. I know that might be hard to believe nowadays because basically nobody remembers the movie, but it's true. It made a good amount of money at the box office. It was a success at the box office. It made more money at the box office than the first Megamind. And number three, it's a fucking Shrek movie. Shrek is DreamWorks' flagship franchise. DreamWorks made a spin-off film for their flagship franchise, and it ended up being successful at the box office. Therefore, a sequel was inevitable. A year later, they start work on a sequel. I don't know if Puss in Boots 2 went through development hell or not, I don't know. The film went through a long development span, much longer than most other animated movies. And then it ends up coming out of nowhere, it ends up being even better than the first film, and it ends up being one of the best movies that DreamWorks ever put out. Again, the first Megamind was a mild success at the box office, however it was one of their lowest grossing films of the 2010s, and the general consensus of it at the time was it was a good movie, but it wasn't anything special. I guess it didn't help that the film came out a few months after Despicable Me, and like both movies share a lot of similarities with their storylines, so people thought that the film felt a little too derivative of stuff like The Incredibles or Despicable Me. The masterpiece status that the movie has now, it wouldn't get it until much later on. And that, my friends, is why Puss in Boots got a proper sequel, but not Megamind. Same thing goes for The Croods as well. I don't know how many of y'all are gonna remember this, but there was a sequel to The Croods that came out a few years ago. It was released at the peak of the pandemic, which could be the reason why nobody remembers it at all. But yeah, there was a sequel to The Croods that happened. The Croods got a proper high quality sequel. But again, there's a reason. Once again, the first Croods movie was a massive success at the box office when it came out, even though nowadays it has become largely forgotten about. A sequel to the first movie had been in development since April of 2013. Only a month after the release of the first movie. Apparently at some point in November of 2016 the film got cancelled, however it was later resurrected in September of 2017, so I thought I'd figure I might as well bring that up. And then eventually the sequel finally came out in November of 2020. Despite the fact that the movie was released during the peak of the pandemic, and despite the fact that it's a sequel to a movie that not a lot of people really remember, it ended up doing pretty decently at the box office, so there's that as well. I love Megamind and I wish it got a better sequel, but at the same time, I'm not really surprised that it just got this cheap, low-budget thing instead. Dreamworks didn't have this movie as their main priority. This was just a dumb side project for their television subsidiary to do, to appeal to those who wanted a follow-up to this 2010 cult classic. The fact that the film came out only a week before Kung Fu Panda 4, I think that says enough, really. Regardless of how you feel about that movie, you cannot deny it's doing pretty good at the box office, so even if it's not doing great critically, it's doing really good commercially. This obviously doesn't excuse the many retcons of the first movie that are in Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate, but at least, now there are several reasons as to why Megamind 2 has much cheaper animation. Now you know why Will Ferrell and David Cross aren't back to voice Megamind or Minion. And really, is Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate really all that different or worse than a lot of the direct-to-video Disney sequels from the 2000s and whatever? Like, listen, I agree, Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate is crap, don't get me wrong, but these are crap as well from what I've heard. I never really watched that many direct-to-video Disney sequels as a kid, however I'm willing to bet that if I watched most of these movies, a lot of them, they'll probably be on the same level of quality as Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate. Actually no, I wouldn't even be surprised if I came across a movie that was much worse than Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate. Don't use Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate as a counterclaim to how DreamWorks sequels aren't better than Disney or Pixar sequels. Shrek 2 alone is better than every Disney and Pixar sequel, with the exceptions of Toy Story 2 and Toy Story 3. And then meanwhile, Ralph Breaks the Internet alone is worse than every single DreamWorks sequel. I don't know if this is a controversial opinion or not. It probably isn't because both movies are considered garbage, but I genuinely think that Ralph Breaks the Internet is a worse movie than Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate. Even after watching Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate and thinking that it was a terrible film and an insulting sequel to Megamind, I still thought that Ralph Breaks the Internet was a worse movie. Just the large amount of product placement and crap that was in Ralph Breaks the Internet, it makes it so much worse, bro. I'm sorry. That Disney self-worshipping, consume Disney product crap that's in Ralph Breaks the Internet, that is some of the cringiest shit I have ever seen in any movie ever. There is nothing in Shrek the Third or Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate or whatever that come close to being as bad as this. I'm sorry. I know that this video is meant to be for why I personally prefer DreamWorks over Disney, but I figured I might as well bring up something that DreamWorks is objectively better at than Disney, and even Pixar as well. Just because DreamWorks put out a mediocre sequel to Kung Fu Panda, and their television subsidiary put out a bad sequel to Megamind, that doesn't mean that DreamWorks sequels are often bad or anything like that. Don't let recency bias distract you from the fact that Shrek 2 is a masterpiece of a movie. I want to move on to something now that I just want to get out of the way. This isn't something that's a big problem right now yet, but I know for a fact that sooner or later people will start complaining about it, so I just want to say all this stuff in advance. In early 2023, it was announced that a live-action remake of How to Train Your Dragon was in development. The movie is expected to come out in the summer of 2025. Now, we've gotten basically no information on this movie movie yet. We don't have a trailer or anything like that for the movie. So admittedly, I could be overreacting to this, or maybe like, saying this stuff a little too early. I know for a fact though, the moment a trailer for this thing drops, a bunch of people are gonna start expressing concern towards this. So I'm just gonna clear this out of the way and just say it. No, Dreamworks isn't going to become just like Disney. Dreamworks isn't going to start making live-action remakes of their movies. You see, here's the difference between Dreamworks and Disney. Well, okay, there's a lot of differences between the two, but here's a difference. Unlike with Disney, most Dreamworks movies just cannot work in live-action at all. I don't like the live-action Disney remakes, but I could see how they could work. I could see how a live-action version of The Little Mermaid or Beauty and the Beast or Aladdin or whatever, I could see how they could work in live action. They're not executed well, but the potential is there for them to maybe work just a little bit. Meanwhile, with Dreamworks, almost none of their movies could work in live action. And the very few Dreamworks movies that could hypothetically work in live action, it's mostly the less popular, lesser known, underrated niche movies. The really big movies like Kung Fu Panda and Madagascar, there's no way for them to work in live action. It is fucking impossible for them to work in live action. I could kind of see Shrek working in live action, maybe, I don't know. I don't think it'll turn out good, but like I could see an attempt to make Shrek in live action. I mean, you had that Shrek musical, so like that could be a reference for what a live action Shrek would look like. But even if they did make a live action version of Shrek, I have a feeling it would only just be the first movie and that's it. I don't see them remaking all 4 movies in live action or anything like that. There are almost no Dreamworks movies that could work in live action at all. Compared to Disney, Dreamworks movies are a lot more cartoony, and I guess as a result of that, these movies there's no way for them to translate into live action. And again, the few Dreamworks movies that could work in live action, they're mostly the less popular, underrated movies. I could kind of see Monsters vs. Aliens working in live action. I could see it being this like Guardians of the Galaxy-esque movie, but it's never going to happen because Monsters vs. Aliens isn't like a big successful Dreamworks movie or anything like that. Most people don't really remember it all that much. How to Train Your Dragon is one of the few Dreamworks movies that could hypothetically work in live action. It's also one of their most successful movies. Therefore, a live-action remake of it kind of makes sense. I'm not defending this movie. I'm not saying it's going to turn out good or anything like that. The movie will probably turn out bad, but like, it'll just be a one-time experiment, and that's it. After that, Dreamworks will never make another live-action version of their movies, because there's barely any Dreamworks movies that can work in live-action. And you know what? If this movie turns out bad, then that further decreases the chances of Dreamworks making more live-action remakes of their movies. I just know for a fact, the moment a trailer for this thing comes out, people are gonna be like, oh no, Dreamworks is gonna become just like Disney, they're gonna start making live-action remakes, animation is cinema, Puss in Boots was a fluke, stuff like that. When it's like, there are almost no Dreamworks movies that can work in live action. You can all calm down. Shark Tale and Turbo aren't gonna get live action remakes anytime soon. Relax. It might be a little too early for me to be saying this stuff, but it's stuff that needs to be said. This is very likely just going to be a one-time thing, and that's it. Much like with Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate. Dreamworks isn't going to start making low-budget sequels like Disney did in the 2000s, and they're not going to start making live-action remakes of their animated movies, just like Disney is doing right now. Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate and the How to Train Your Dragon remake, they are most definitely just going to be one-time experiments, and that's it. What you should be worrying about are the recent layoffs that have occurred for Dreamworks. Back in March of this year, it was announced that a lot of people would be laid off of Dreamworks, which is a very unfortunate thing. I also remember reading something that like Kung Fu Panda 4 was significantly rushed at the last minute, which I'm aware of the very mixed negative reception that the movie has garnered, but that just explains more about why the movie turned out the way that it did. I'm not sure if this is 100% connected to the layoffs, but I figured I might as well bring it up. Their next animated movie, The Wild Robot, is also apparently going to be their final in-house movie. And then after The Wild Robot, Dreamworks is going to start outsourcing their animation to other studios, which is really unfortunate. It is sad to see that like a lot of this stuff is going on behind the scenes at Dreamworks, but I feel like it is important for me to note that this has nothing to do with the quality of the movies themselves. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish turning out amazing, and then every subsequent Dreamworks movie after Puss in Boots: The Last Wish not turning out very amazing, that has nothing to do with any of this stuff. There's no correlation at all. No, Patrick, Megamind vs. the Doom Syndicate has nothing to do with Dreamworks laying off their employees and outsourcing their animation to other studios. There is no correlation at all. The future of Dreamworks feels very mixed, to say the least. Yes, you have stuff like Dogman and The Bad Guys 2, and maybe those could turn out good, but it really does feel like after The Wild Robot, it'll be the end of an era for Dreamworks. They're not going to be the same as they were before. Who knows how their movies will turn out after they stop being made in-house. Obviously, the quality of the movies themselves aren't that important when compared to the layoffs, but it is something that should still be talked about. Imagine if after all these years we finally get Shrek 5 and Madagascar 4, and then they end up being not that great. Considering the large amount of time that has passed between the last Shrek and Madagascar movies, maybe it's better to just have these movies end off with their respective final films. I know the post-credits scene for Puss in Boots: The Last Wish teased Shrek 5, but like, that was back before all of this stuff happened. Maybe it's better to just have Shrek end with Shrek Forever After, and have Madagascar end with Europe's Most Wanted. And then for Kung Fu Panda, I've heard that like for a long time they were planning to make 6 Kung Fu Panda movies, so who knows if they'll go forward with those 5th and 6th movies. Even if the 4th movie hasn't gotten the most amazing critical reception, it's been doing really well at the box office, so who knows how things will turn out. Regardless though, I am very concerned for the future of Dreamworks. I'm concerned for those that are working there, and I'm just concerned about how things will turn out not having Dreamworks make their movies in-house and instead just outsourcing their animation to other studios. Times have just been very depressing for Dreamworks, and one can only hope that things will eventually get better for them. Whatever the case may be though, I will never forget the memories that I have for their movies. Even the weaker films like Shark Tale and Shrek the Third, I can't help but have just a little bit of nostalgia for them, a little bit of a soft spot for them, but at the very least we could still appreciate a lot of their classic movies from the 2000s and 2010s. I'm not necessarily sure if I would consider Dreamworks my favorite animation studio. Again, it's hard for me to choose if I like Pixar more or if I like Dreamworks more, but I can confidently say that I honestly prefer them over Disney. This has nothing to do with how Disney is nowadays. This has nothing to do with Wish or anything like that. This is an opinion that I have held since childhood. I just feel a lot more emotionally attached to Megamind than a lot of movies from the Disney canon. That's not to say that there aren't amazing movies in the Disney canon, because there certainly are. But a lot of the movies that are in the Disney canon, they just don't hit me in the same way that the best Dreamworks movies do. So even if the worst were to happen to Dreamworks in the nearby future, at least we could appreciate the memories memories that they've left behind with their movies. Don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened, as they say. Anyways, that's about it. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like, and if you're new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing, as it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and I will see you all next time. Adios.